People out there responsible for payroll functions. It's becoming more and more and more complex to stay abreast of all these rules. So making sure they've got appropriate sources of guidance and information coming through to keep them on top of these things. Because if they just rely on HMRC guidance, then they'll be behind the curve, sure. On some of these matters. So I think it's really about where do I get that from? And obviously there's lots of sources out there.
Welcome to the Payroll Podcast with your host, Nick Day. Find out what it takes to truly discover what it takes to elevate your career within payroll as we meet with the industry leaders who are shaping the industry for tomorrow.
So right now I am sat in Canary Wharf in the beautiful Deloitte offices, and I'm about to be joined on the Payroll Podcast sofa by Helen Kaye and Chris Robson. Now, Helen is the partner who leads Deloitte's global employment services practice across the regions, but until very recently, she also led the Deloitte national team responsible for providing payroll advisory services to clients. And that would have included strategic advice, vendor selection, payroll reviews, and payroll implementations. Helen is now focusing most of her time on pay governance. And that's very much going to be the focus of today's podcast. So do stay tuned. She's the partner responsible nationally for Deloitte's pay governance services. Prior to Deloitte, she also spent 11 years with the HMRC. So this is one expert who really knows her stuff. But we're not just joined by one, we're also joined by Chris Robson. Now, he's Deloitte's pay governance specialist, and having spent many, many years advising clients on areas such as national minimum wage, holiday pay, gender pay gap reporting, and pensions auto enrolment. The fact is, and sorry, Chris, it's quite a sad fact, but the truth is you're probably the person who has spent the longest time supporting employers with their national minimum wage compliance. And we know that pay governance is a consistently hot topic. So get your notebooks out, get your pens at the ready to take notes. We're about to dive deep into issues including the government's Good Work Plan, holiday pay rights, and wider worker rights, as well as the single enforcement body consultation. This is a really insightful podcast you're going to enjoy, and Chris and Helen bring with it a wealth of experience and a great sense of humour as well. So sit back, relax, here we go.
5 quick questions.
So let's dive straight into the detail. Let's jump into the questions. I'm going to start with yourself, Chris. I wondered if you could just describe to our listeners a little bit more about what the Good Work Plan is and how it came about.
So the Good Work Plan is really the worker rights element of the government industrial strategy. Over the last few years, government have been driving towards understanding what the workforce of UK PLC looks like. And that's not just employees, but also the gig economy and those in the self-employed bucket as well. And really what they have done is gone out to a number of people and said, look, let's have a look around UK PLC. What's working well, what isn't? Can we come up with some recommendations? And one of the main reports which came out of that was the Taylor Review, so Matthew Taylor. And basically he came up with a number of recommendations, and many of those recommendations were adopted by government over the last few years, which has led on to a number of consultations.
Sure. So by way of background, tell me a little bit more, Helen, if you can, about the Good Work Plan journey. So how did it really, you mentioned the Matthew Taylor report there, give us a little bit more context.
Yeah, so as Chris mentioned, Matthew Taylor was instrumental in pulling that report together, and what then happened was, off the back of that, the government produced a strategy to say, okay, how do we now put in place a number of these recommendations? And in great government style, it leads to yet more consultations and so on. And one of the things that was really recommended by Matthew Taylor and coming out with the Good Work Plan was that there should be something called a single enforcement body. Okay. And so a single enforcement body, which is currently being consulted on, is really looking to say, okay, all the different elements of pay governance, should we have those governed by one enforcement body? And if we do, what should that enforcement body look like? And for your listeners who are thinking, well, what do you mean by enforcement body? If I can use an example, if we go back a number of years, national minimum wage, it was decided that Revenue and Customs would be responsible for enforcing compliance with national minimum wage. And off the back of that, they really got together a full process to go out to UK PLC and really undertake very detailed reviews to make sure that organisations were being compliant with all the intricacies of the national minimum wage rules. And you can decide what you might think about it depending on which side of the fence you're on and whether you've been through one of those reviews. But ultimately, it's been seen as a real success because the amount of additional monies coming back through to employees from errors that have been made by business as part of identification through these reviews has been significant. And for anyone who's been through those reviews, you'll also know that we'll have seen this in the press. That review had with it teeth. So when I mean teeth, I mean real teeth in the sense of penalties. So the current penalty is 200% of the amount that then is repaid to the employees.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, exactly. And, not only the hard fact of hard penalties, but in addition to that, there's also naming and shaming. So this is why the press has been very on top of this and has been out there whenever the naming and shaming list gets produced. And let's remember, you only need to have an aggregate underpayment of £100 or more to get on that naming and shaming list. It's been a real damaging factor to businesses when it comes to their employee brand. So when we're talking about a single enforcement body, what we're talking about is, should we have something that potentially looks like that type of enforcement, but across a number of different worker rights? So things like holiday pay and a whole host of other things, which I'm sure Chris is going to come on to as well.
So I know that you've been delivering consultations, Chris, and obviously this is work that you do. You work with clients to bring them up to speed in what the good work plan, how it affects them and what's happening. For those listening to this at the moment who perhaps, despite the news, aren't as familiar, maybe they're a payroll manager going, okay, I kind of know what the good work plan is, but I don't really know how that affects me. Can you just give us a little bit more, information around how it's affecting payroll departments, and from a payroll manager that perhaps isn't up to speed, why this is important and why this is directly affecting me?
Yeah, so Helen's mentioned the national minimum wage there and that is really being used as a trailblazer. So I think most people who have been through a national minimum wage inquiry over the last few years will say that they've never really experienced a national minimum wage inquiry before.
Sure.
So the whole frequency is one factor, and then the approach by HMRC in that instance is very different to even how their colleagues in other parts of HMRC will approach a tax and national insurance review or inquiry. The direction of travel based on this single enforcement body consultation is that we're also then going to have this body that covers, as Helen says, things like holiday pay, the gangmaster regulations, the employment agency regulations, and maybe some other areas as well. So it will be a one-stop shop for all worker rights. And so if you look at the landscape at the moment of if you have an employee who is disgruntled over whether it's minimum wage or holiday pay, that whichever area it is, it'll differ which body they go to say, look, I have a problem. So, national minimum wage, yes, they'd go to ACAS first, and then that would be passed on to HMRC. If it's holiday pay, they really need to bring a claim through the tribunals. Okay. Whereas if it's within the gangmasters or the employment agencies field, then there's a different part of government that looks after that as well. So, looking at the models in, say, Australia or Ireland or France, they already have similar enforcement bodies where those bodies will proactively go out and undertake a review of worker rights more generally, rather than just the topic of national minimum wage or something like that.
I think to add to that, if we're being balanced about this, there would be a lot of positives coming out from a single enforcement body. So, yes, it does mean there could be an awful lot more focus, and employers could expect more scrutiny and a much larger degree of controlled review by that body. However, I think the two real positives would be, first of all, from an employee or a worker perspective, it gives them a really easy access route to get to the bottom of what could be issues and challenges that they are experiencing. And as Chris mentioned, at the minute, that can be incredibly difficult. Often they have to, raise a claim and go to tribunal. Many are put off by doing that because, one, it can be very time consuming, it can be incredibly stressful, it can be potentially costly, but also if they're in employment, they can also be fearful about, well, what does that actually mean for me to raise a claim whilst I'm in employment against my employer? So I think from an employee perspective, that is, or a worker, obviously, and there's a distinction between the two, I think that that's a real positive. On the other side, I think business can benefit as well because they've been very balanced in the consultation around what that enforcement body would be there for. And one of the things that the enforcement body would really be there for would be to provide better guidance, better support to business to understand and navigate their way through all of these very complex and evolving rules. So I think if we had one enforcement body, it would be much more straightforward and simple to get appropriate support, which is absolutely what business is needing.
And you've covered a lot of this already, but I'm keen to know, so what does a single enforcement body consultation suggest maybe in store for employers in particular?
The single enforcement body would pretend, and this is not an immediate play because of the political landscape at the moment.
Sure.
What we foresee is, something similar to the national minimum wage enforcement, but just across those different areas that we've mentioned. So, as Helen mentioned earlier, the naming and shaming and the penalties has been very effective in the eyes of government. But this consultation also goes a little bit further, and again, whether this will happen in practice, I'm not so sure. But there is also reference in there to potentially joint responsibility within the supply chain as well. So if we take the example of a supermarket supply chain, potentially a supplier that within that supply chain to that supermarket fails on worker rights somehow, would the supermarket be held jointly responsible? So naming and shaming and penalties for that for the supermarket as well. And taking it a step further, there also is reference in there to the withholding of goods as well. So would the goods of that supplier effectively be frozen in the supply chain so that that can't move up the supply chain and ultimately would affect the supermarket as well? So that's where we could potentially end up based on the way this consultation is written.
So essentially it's going to result in more coordination, pooled intelligence and better support to businesses if we're pulling these things together, which would be seen as a positive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the aim. The aim is to make sure that businesses are compliant, but they're supported in meeting that compliance obligation in order that workers receive the rights that are expected and that are due to them under the law. So, at big picture level, absolutely. I think what business is nervous about is some of the guidance at the minute is a bit poor, to be quite frank. It's quite ambiguous, and it's often, we're working in many cases with legislation that just isn't suitable for modern working practices. So working practices are evolving and changing. They're changing at a rate much, much quicker than the legislation. So you have, sets of legislation that say one thing, and then, for poor people in the HR teams and the payroll teams and within business, trying to then work out, okay, well, how does that apply practically to how my workers are actually working? The disconnect between the two is difficult. So what they then need is clear guidance, and the guidance at the minute is quite ambiguous. So there is a hope that with one single enforcement body, some of that ambiguity would be removed, and that would really, really help business. On the other side of the coin, businesses that have been through large-scale national minimum wage reviews will know that it can be really quite painful, regardless of the outcome, and whether anything is or is not owing at the end of the review. The actual process of going through the review in terms of the quantity of data, the information, the time it takes, that can put an awful lot of burden on the internal teams, both HR reward teams and, of course, payroll teams. So that in itself is quite difficult, and I think that the fear is actually if you suddenly start having a whole host of these different types of reviews, because the enforcement agency really gets its act together and gets out there and starts to undertake structured and systematic reviews, is that, do you almost reinvent an entirely new team that just have to be there to deal with handling these reviews?
Sure. I imagine there's a number of payroll managers listening to this podcast right now who are with their head in their hands saying this is not a new thing where the HMRC or the guidance isn't quite as up to speed as it should be with the speed that the compliance is changing, right? And often this is a common problem that they have where new compliance or legislation changes, but the guidelines don't quite come out as quickly as they should. And it's a common problem that payroll managers are faced with, or frustration, should I say?
Yeah, it is, and to a large extent we rely upon payroll systems and HR systems to support us around that. And kind of sticking with the theme of national minimum wage, it's quite clear that because of the way that national minimum wage has evolved over the last 20 odd years, the payroll software and also the way advice is being provided to clients around the writing of contracts and everything else has meant that there have been these failures which are now only coming to light because of the increased enforcement. So I do foresee over the next few years, especially if this single enforcement body evolves, we are going to kind of be moving the dial a little bit more back to spending time on compliance matters rather than being able to spend a bit more time being a little bit more strategic, really.
So how fearful should a business be? I'm thinking, okay, I work in recruitment, not payroll, but GDPR being an interesting example where the GDPR legislation came in, everyone went crazy to make sure they were compliant, and then actually, in terms of enforcement, the ICO didn't really have the numbers to enforce the legislation to make sure people were compliant quickly enough. Are we going to have a similar problem in this situation, or do you think the enforcement body will get their act together quick enough where employers need to be fearful and make sure they have their ducks lined up quickly?
So it's an interesting one, and I will gaze into my crystal ball because at the minute it is still consultation, so we don't know. However, there's a double edge here, isn't there, in terms of extra enforcement means that what would be deemed to be our most vulnerable workers in society are getting what's due to them. Yeah. So there's definitely a there's a slant there that says this is an important thing to do. Equally with penalties, significant penalties do go into the treasury. So is that essentially self-funding? And what we've seen with national minimum wage is when they really said, okay, we are now going to enforce this and we're going to put a proper process in place where we can really get into the detail, the government did put money behind it. So we saw a significant investment in the number of staff that were involved and upskilling of staff involved at HMRC in the compliance. So the numbers, please don't quote me on this, and I'm not going to be audited, but I think the numbers went nationally from about 75 people up to about 350 people.
Wow, okay.
And there was something like £25 million worth of investment put into that team. So when you're talking that order of magnitude, they really did enable them to put the teeth behind it. I think, if they're going to do this and we do move into a single enforcement agency or body, then it's likely that we'll see something similar as well, because they will want to make a statement around this. So my view is, yes, I think they probably will put investment around it. Can they claw that investment back through potential penalties that are raised as part of the process? Quite possibly.
It sounds significant enough where it needs to be taken very seriously. Now, you've mentioned holiday pay a few times. And you've explained holiday pay enforcement, that it might be brought under the remit of this potential new government body. So can you explain a little bit more for the listeners around the issues that are surrounding holiday pay?
Yeah, so holiday pay is one of those areas that has been kicking around for a while. It's led by EU law that's effectively been tried and brought into the UK sphere. Here in the UK, we really probably don't calculate holiday entitlement and holiday pay in the same way as some of our neighbours in the EU. Effectively, where we've got to through case law and the case law evolving over a number of years is that there are probably a number of employers and systems which are probably calculating holiday pay in a different way to where the case law sits at the moment. And the case law does continue to evolve as well. And ultimately, the example would be that, if somebody goes on holiday and doesn't receive the average kind of normal remuneration that they would receive on the run-up to their holiday, then potentially the employee could bring a claim against the worker. So people might have heard of the Locke versus British Gas case, which considered whether commission should be averaged and effectively paid. And similarly, there's cases like Bear Scotland and the Freightliner cases, which talked about commissions and overtime and the like. So what we are seeing is that some employers are actually getting a grip with this and have made changes already. There are others who are aware of it, it's on their radar, but might not have really done much or are taking the ostrich approach of sticking their head in the sand. And then there are some employers where this just isn't on their radar at the moment, but it is something that they're going to need to think about over the next few years. And so, as I mentioned, it's case law at the moment that's driving this. We don't have legislation and regulation other than we will, from April 2020, have a change in law around the reference period, so looking back 52 weeks rather than 12, which kind of case law has got us to. And so we're going to end up potentially, if we have a single enforcement body, and we're going to have officers a little bit like HMRC officers enforcing this the holiday pay rights, then we're going to have legislation and regulation. And as we've seen with national minimum wage, if you don't get the legislation and the regulations and the guidance right, that can create a big headache for both employers and the officers who are looking to enforce that as well.
I never actually realised that there wasn't any specific legislation or regulations that determined how holiday pay should be calculated.
So we do have legislation which talks about entitlements. But here in the UK, we've traditionally paid people their basic pay when they go on holiday, rather than kind of like the average of their pay. So things like where they work regular overtime, earn regular commission, earn regular allowances, that isn't really thought of. And for many employers, they are led by how their payroll provider has kind of set up their system, how it was done when that payroll provider worked with the last employer in that industry. And so you do see a lot of industries where it's a common error and it's always the same one.
So what government guidance is coming out on how to calculate holiday pay going forward? Do we know the answer to that yet?
So the real change is, as I mentioned, from April 2020, there is going to be a change for the reference period to effectively be across a 52-week period on the run-up to the holiday, rather than at the moment kind of the 12 or 13-week averaging period. And then in addition to that, we do have some guidance out already, which effectively looks very complicated from a calculation perspective, because what it drives you to do is look at anybody with variable pay and identify their average pay on a week basis, even where they are paid, say, monthly. The like. And so systems are going to need to be able to deal with that as this continues to evolve. And
are there any other implications for these changes around holiday pay, for employers and people within payroll and HR?
So they're going to have to be able to deal with queries that start coming through from individuals. So as more publicity around this comes to the fore, and there are a number of cases which have been stayed in the tribunals and the courts behind some of the bigger cases. We're going to see more of this. Some of the unions already have this on their radar and have spoken to a number of the larger employers. But we are seeing more and more activity. So you're going to have to be able to actually understand what the issues are and be able to respond to those queries, and ultimately be able to have conversations with your software providers to say, well, what is the functionality within there, and what changes do we need to make?
As a recruiter, or a sales professional, as it essentially is, I'd imagine any business in the UK that has a sales or commission-based workforce are going to be putting in huge numbers of inquiries to their payroll departments to say, what am I going to be paid over holiday pay?
Yeah, I mean, I see the challenge so a payroll department, I see the real challenge is keeping abreast of all the case law, and then understanding at what point do I need to respond to that case law versus actually, can I just wait and see until something forms precedent or something then becomes into actual law? And it's keeping abreast of the change. And, you're in that situation where payroll is responsible for applying the policy and getting the payroll calculations correct. But ultimately, they're then linking in with reward teams, HR teams, finance teams, and it's the real challenge is for them to constantly be at the front and understanding and getting sources of information that enable them to make the right decisions or flag to other teams that are responsible for policy when something needs to happen. And to my mind, that's the real challenge. So I think, people out there responsible for payroll functions, it's becoming more and more and more complex to stay abreast of all these rules. So making sure they've got appropriate sources of guidance and information coming through to keep them on top of these things. Because if they just rely on HMRC guidance, then they'll be behind the curve,
Sure.
on some of these matters. So I think it's really about where do I get that from? And obviously there's lots of sources out there.
I think one of the things I love about that response, Helen, is for many payroll managers out there at the moment, and the conversations I'm having regularly, is this fear of automation, which is coming whether we like it or not in terms of some of the more menial tasks. But I think that's a great example of where you still need, genuine payroll expertise to handle this legislative changes, the speed of changes, to understand policy, to outsource that to a chatbot, for example, with the number of inquiries coming in is going to be quite complex. So I think for those, whether you're up to speed with the Good Work Plan or not and what's coming, if nothing else, knowing that there's a real requirement to stay ahead of policy, which needs that human element, I think the payroll managers will like to hear that response that you just given.
Absolutely. And I think for a payroll manager as well, to be able to take, there will be policy changes. Businesses will be changing their policies, and then with policy change comes process change to affect that. And it's about saying, okay, that might be all well and good. We've got this new fantastic policy that does everything it needs to do, but my payroll system can't deal with this. And now, yes, I need everything to be automated, but all of a sudden I've got manual intervention needs to come into play. Well, that's not good enough. So now I need to go through, changing the system, whichever operating system you're working on, to make sure that it can meet the policy. And the two at the minute, I think, often are disconnected. And so you've got payroll teams having to come up with solutions to these challenges that more often than not are just not ideal.
Sure.
And technology has a bigger part to play as well, where you do get a claim from an individual. So, let's assume that you can get the system working for the future, but actually we've worked with a lot of employers where they've had to look at the historic liability when somebody comes to say, look, I think I am due some extra pay, and you've got to layer over that all of your HR and payroll data, where you get that from to do the calculation, and how does that actually interact with the ability to bring a claim, from a legal perspective as well. So it can get quite complicated, both forward-looking as well as historic-looking.
And of course, if you are a payroll manager listening to this and a little bit worried now about some legislation that's changing, and you need some support or guidance, there are consultancies like yourselves who are helping payroll managers and employers to make sure they are up to speed and following legislation correctly. And I will, for those interested, put the contact details for both Chris and Helen in the episode notes. If you're interested, go to the episode notes, find their contact details, and you can reach out to Deloitte directly if you are worried about any of the topics that we're discussing at the moment. So could the Good Work Plan change as the political landscape starts to evolve?
Yes, it could change. However, I think, regardless of what colour of government we may have, or multicolours of government that we may actually have in power at the time, it's unlikely that worker rights are going to fall off the radar. If anything, any change in government is likely to mean that worker rights is amplified even more so. So there could be changes around existing plans. There could be changes around timescales for implementation, but do we see these issues falling out of priority? Absolutely not. And we do think that worker rights is something that is going to continually evolve and strengthen, and it is a focus of all the government, all of the political parties.
Sure, fantastic. So We want to find out now, and just go into the other section to find out a little bit more about the two of you, just to bring you guys to life a little bit here as well from outside of the compliance and the data and the policy. This is just a quick advert to let you know that if you haven't heard the latest payroll song that's doing the rounds and was played recently at the CIPP conference, then you don't want to miss it. It's called My Payroll Career. It's available now on iTunes and Amazon Play, YouTube and other sources as well. If you love payroll like we do, then go check it out. My Payroll Career, available now on iTunes, Amazon Play, YouTube and more, so check it out. Right, back to the podcast.
Time to find out more about you.
So, Chris, if I start with yourself, which individual has influenced your career so much today?
So I would actually say an inspector at HMRC who is no longer there.
Okay.
I think there's a sad fact that I've done an awful lot of national minimum wage in my life and provided a lot of support to clients around that. And a lot of my knowledge and relationships came from a guy called Gabriel Murphy, who was a fantastic inspector in terms of, he could enforce the rules the way they needed to be done, but also did it in a supportive way. And I definitely think back on my career and think, I've learned an awful lot from the way that he operated. Excellent.
I've been doing these podcasts for a while now. It's the first time I've ever had an HMRC inspector as the influence. So let's take that and bottle that up. That's great. That's good. And you spent 11 years with HMRC.
I did, at the start of my career. So I came straight out of school into HMRC, really enjoyed my time there in civil service, 11 years, and then decided, okay, it's time to move on and do something a bit different. So I've now been at Deloitte for 20 years. I can't really pinpoint any one individual as to who's been the most influential around my career. What I would say is what I think is hugely important is I've had role models. I've seen people that have succeeded, and what I've been able to do is say, well, do you know what? I really like that about what they've done, or I really like their leadership style, or I really like how they manage or navigate this situation. And I've always been one, I'm a bit of a sponge, so I've always been one for saying, I want as many mentors around me and people that, one, can advocate for me, but two, can really offer support. So I've always gone out and sought that and worked with lots of different people that I respect who've had great careers and taken what I can from them. And I think that's really helped me in terms of my career and how it evolved.
Fantastic. Well, I was basically multiple shout outs there without giving any individual names, which we like. So what about from a resources perspective? Are there any particular resources that either of you have had that have really helped your careers?
Yeah, I'm going to do a shout out to my other half actually, because I know it's not a direct payroll resource, but I've in this working environment that's quite a tough and challenging working environment. I couldn't have done this without the support of having somebody at home that was really, really supportive to enable my career to go where it has. And what I mean by that is, he will happily sit there and hear the issues and challenges and interesting intricacies of pay governance and payroll, etc. And he's always there to, lift me at the end of a hard working day. So I do really think I'd want to do a shout out to Andy, actually, who's really helped me throughout my career in terms of being successful.
It takes a unique individual, let's be fair, to go home. My wife is the same, and listen to the issues that affect payroll if you're not in payroll. So,
well, considering he's got his own dog walking company, so he couldn't be a different, sure, polar opposites of type of career. But he diligently sits there and listens with intent, intensely to what I have to say when I'm talking about my day at the office.
Excellent. Well, great shout out there for Andy. How about yourself, Chris?
Well, I think you've stolen my thunder there, because I've obviously got to say the same as well now. So, otherwise I'll get told. No, but my wife Lucy, we're a little bit different to Helen and Andy in that Lucy is also a tax advisor as well. So I can go home and have those same conversations, and she actually as well as being a sounding board, can actually provide some advice and say, well, why don't you try this a different way? So she's been fantastic.
Great, fantastic. So while we're talking about individuals and inspirations, between the two of you, or individually, I don't mind, if you could invite 3 people to a dinner party, they can be dead or alive, who would they be and why? I'll start with you, Helen.
Oh, well, I'm just looking in the room here, and what better dinner party could you have than us 3?
I'll take that. That's my second invite since I've been doing it.
Has it? Brilliant, okay.
From my perspective, I don't know whether I can think of 3. I mean, I like the way that Richard Branson operates. Actually, I've read his books, and got a lot of time for the way that he operates. I think, given where we are at the moment, you'd have to have Mr. Attenborough there, and I think basically you don't need anybody else in the room, because you could just say, right, tell us about nature, and everybody sits back and sips with a glass of wine. Yeah,
definitely. I think Attenborough, absolutely. I would love that. I also think someone who would be fascinating just because of what they've seen, and then their career and where they've gone, is Michelle Obama. I think it would be really interesting to get the insights through what she's gone through in her life, what she's seen, the challenges that have been faced, but then how inspirational she's been to so many people as well. I think she'd be a great guest.
Excellent. I've just done the radio type recording error that you never see, which I've been sat here nodding and realised that no one can see me nod. So in total agreement with all those. Excellent. Well, listen, we're going to jump to a quick advert break, and then we're going to jump into part 2.
Have you ever asked yourself, how can I recruit payroll staff effectively? Please don't give up on your recruitment project just yet. Here at JGA Payroll Recruitment, we appreciate the difficulties associated with attracting, recruiting and retaining top payroll talent. We also understand just how costly a poor payroll hire can be. JGA Recruitment are a niche payroll recruitment agency who will partner with you to resource payroll candidates who will improve both the accuracy and efficiency of your payroll department. Contact us today on 01727 800 377 or visit jgarecruitment.com to find out more.
5 technical questions.
So I'd like to take the opportunity, if I can, to dig a little deeper into both your passions for payroll, or pay governance in particular for yourself, Chris.
Yeah.
So with this in mind, what do you love most about payroll, and what are the biggest challenges potentially that we've got ahead?
So for me, I think what I enjoy most is the fact that I'm helping so many clients with national minimum wage at the moment, actually being able to get to a position where we're not just telling them about this is a problem that you have, but getting to the solution. And it's quite an interesting life cycle when you work with a client who has just, say, had HMRC knock on the door. So you kind of go through that whole emotional cycle of denial and disbelief to angry to, right, how do we start to sort this out? And so that's what I kind of take home at the end of the day, is we've done a good job because we've been able to get the client to see where HMRC are coming from, what the business is doing at the moment, and how to get it right. And I think more widely, them being able to now understand, which wasn't the case 2 or 3 years ago, but to understand that other employers are going through that pain as well.
Sure.
And I think, from my perspective, it's always about people. Everything comes down to people. It's what I love in my job, that I meet different people every day, and constantly getting to know new people. So, and from a payroll perspective, payroll department, unlike most other departments, absolutely touches people in real lives. You do a job really well and you get things right, which most payroll teams do day in, day out. They're the unsung heroes. But when something goes wrong and somebody doesn't get paid, everybody knows about it. Yeah, so it's a bit like, goalkeepers. Goalkeeper lets in a stinker of a goal and everybody talks about it, but they make 5 saves and it doesn't really get commented on that much. It's a similar thing. And so to my mind, it's that job satisfaction of knowing that in doing your job incredibly well, you are you are literally impacting people's lives, because it's all about what they're taking home and then what they can then do with that to feed their families, etc., etc. So it's that real live side of things that I think brings what's deemed to be often, an administrative function. It brings that to life.
Absolutely love the goalkeeper analogy. I'm going to reuse that, by the way, and can claim it as my own, Helen. That was really, really good.
Just don't ask me the offside rule.
Okay,
no, I do know.
I don't understand it anymore. It's not too complex.
It is a bit complex now.
So if there was a payroll podcast subject, so I'm doing another podcast now that is going to come after this one, what's the one subject area that would really grab both of your attentions?
So at the moment, IR35 is probably the biggest other area that we're advising on outside of the sphere of pay governance.
Yeah.
And I guess the timing of this podcast will mean that employers really, really should be in a position where they've got their hands around it now. So IR35 for me.
There's still time for that legislation potentially to change, of course, before April, and if it's going to be rolled out exactly as is, it's something that I'd be equally interested in listening to as a recruiter that's affecting my industry massively. How about yourself, Helen?
Well, absolutely, I agree with that. And for a lot of businesses where, the use of contractors has been a core part to their business model and has evolved that way over recent years, what you're finding is actually it's going to be quite a significant impact on the payroll teams, where withholdings, they are essentially going to have to treat a number of those contractors on payroll. And so really thinking about, okay, well, how do I manage that? And what does that mean in terms of my payroll, my function, my system? That's going to be really quite interesting. And as you say, my advice to clients at the minute is carry on preparing as if it's going to happen, because it's not the kind of thing that you'll just be able to switch on overnight if you're hoping that there's going to be, a pause. Then I think that would be a little bit foolhardy. I think people do need to continue to be prepared, because they wouldn't be able to just switch this on overnight if it does go ahead in April 2020, which I expect it likely will.
Sure. And I think another area as well would be around the gender pay gap and the BAME reporting and how that's going to evolve. So as we move into the third year of reporting, I think most employers feel that they have their hands around how to get to the numbers that they need to report. More of the support that we're giving to clients now is around, well, what do those numbers mean? How do you reduce that gap? And with the consultation around the BAME numbers still being in play as well, what does that look like? Do you actually hold the information within your systems and to be able to start to look at those numbers as that evolves further?
That ties in quite nicely to my next question, which is within the Deloitte consultancy practice, what kind of trends are you seeing at present, and what type of work do you find yourself regularly supporting the clients with, aside from governance? And you mentioned R35, which is a fantastic element. People are, while I'm here, interested in finding out more about R35, and again, look at the episode notes to get in touch with Chris or Helen. What other trends are you seeing in the market at the moment?
Absolutely, businesses are focused on how can we do more to automate what we are doing, automate our process, make our processes more effective and efficient, and free up our people to use their skills in different ways. So being more strategic, spending that time in other ways that adds additional value into the business. So pretty much right across the spectrum of employment taxes and payroll, we are seeing this shift from, are we getting the most out of our systems? Have we automated what we can? Are our end-to-end processes as effective as they could be? And obviously it's all set in the backdrop of, and do they meet the requirements at the start, which we talked about right at the start of this podcast, those ever-evolving requirements and that people need to be compliant with.
So a futuristic question then, because Deloitte are right ahead of, you have to be ahead of the curve in terms of what's happening, not just in terms of legislation, but robotics, automation, technology, all of those elements that obviously form the guidance that you give clients. If I asked you both to predict what payroll look like in 2025, which will soon be here, it'll come around quicker than we think, how would that look like? What will the future of payroll look like in 2025?
So for me, and I appreciate people might not want to hear this, but it is going to be around the technology and the automation. So maybe, I think more what I would like to see, rather than maybe what might happen in that 6-7 year period or whatever, would be getting to a position where the systems talk to each other in a much better way. So From a consultant's perspective, we work with clients where there are a number of different permutations of systems, and really we could do with a more common linkage between them, and ultimately that would allow advisors such as Helen and I to maybe link into those systems in a real-time basis to be able to help clients with their compliance and the strategy around their payroll.
Great.
I don't know if this will come to pass or not. But I do think that from a payroll perspective, it's going to be far more employee-led or worker-led in terms of being able to be way more flexible about how and when they get paid. We're already seeing this now with the start of, businesses out there that are able to offer employees, actually, you don't just get paid at the end of the month, you can call on your pay, it's pay on demand, etc. I think that there could be a much greater degree of that, which in one way is fantastic for employees or workers. It's not so great for payroll teams who like process and like certainty, in terms of, they're going to have to think really creatively about, okay, how do we then keep abreast of that and remain compliant in that ever evolving and changing world where things can be way more agile. So I think that might happen. Who knows? I could be proved totally wrong. I think the other side of things would be really what Chris was saying, but a lot more direct and automated interface. And I think there'll be direct and automated interface with government. So we already see a number of overseas locations where, so it's in Germany, for example, where there's a direct interface between a business and their payroll system and the authorities, where, so at the minute, okay, we've got RTI, for example, but more than that, you still have to make that interface happen. I just think it will be a seamless interface. And so that level of automation where the information comes into the system and it automatically feeds through to government and potentially other third parties, banks and so on, I think that will happen. And then we'll have all the headaches of, well, how does that happen and how does GDPR interplay with that? But I'm sure there are other advisors out there who are prepared to talk on that.
So if you think we may or may not, and obviously we're speculating here, have more, as you say, ministerial conversation or transparency, I don't know what word you use, but in terms of that fluidity between conversations, do you think by 2025 payroll may have ministerial governance for payroll, or do you think that will stay as is?
That's a really interesting question. I think it is difficult in terms of the overall, because payroll is an output, isn't it? It's an output of lots of different laws.
Yes.
that then the employer needs to be compliant with. And so at the minute, what we're saying is actually all those laws they tend to be governed by different bodies. Some of that might come together in the single enforcement body that we were talking about, but it won't bring everything together. Is there an overarching authority? I don't know. Maybe you should put that recommendation forward.
I think we've got to look at kind of why RTI came in the first instance, and that was to support universal credit more than anything. So that it's there more of an information collecting piece. I think given as we're moving to 2020 and we're talking about what it's going to look like in, say, 2025, experience tells me that consultation will take 3, 4, 5 years for anything close to what you're explaining there. So I don't see it being there by 2025, but you never know.
Maybe in the future. Well, that ties us in nicely as we're going to open the vault.
Entering the vault.
One piece of advice either of you would give to someone working in payroll right now. So this is someone who perhaps is just coming into the industry. We're desperately trying to encourage more people to come into the industry from an earlier age. What would be the one piece of advice either of you would give?
I would say don't get yourself boxed in and keep your personal development going. So take the opportunity to keep an open mind and be really open to change. You are going to be working in a changing environment and you don't want to pigeonhole yourself into being somebody who can just do X, Y, or Z.
Sure.
You need to be able to show that you have got a broader skill set and that you'll be adaptable and that you'll be able to meet those changing demands as change comes through. So I would say continue to focus where you can on your personal development and have that open mindset to change.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I guess from my experience, it's probably how to build relationships within the business. So we work with a lot of clients where actually payroll doesn't have the voice that it should have. And I personally think that needs to change. You can be in a room with a number of different people, tax, finance, payroll, HR, and sometimes it's, payroll is saying, I think we've got a problem here, we can't do that, and they're kind of overridden. But I know that if that payroll person has a concern, that you really need to draw that out and understand it. So I think, whether just coming into payroll now or whether you've been in payroll for 20, 30 years, that's something that would be good to see kind of change and evolve over the next
I think it's an excellent point. Finding your voice and raising the profile of payroll is something that most of the industry is passionate about doing. We certainly are here in the podcast, so great response. And actually, as you mentioned, Helen, both of you are great examples that you don't, coming into payroll as a payroll administrator doesn't mean you have to stay in administration all the way through your career. There's so many angles within payroll, whether it's project management, implementation, consulting, or payroll management, which is equally as rewarding. There are many avenues that a payroll career can take you on, and I think that's really important. We highlight that to the individuals coming in as well. If you both had the power of foresight and could change the entire payroll industry with one action or improvement, what would that action or improvement be?
For me, it probably goes back to an answer that I gave earlier, and getting systems talking to each other on a single footing. So every developer has come up with their own their own systems and unique offerings, which has made it quite challenging for employers to actually get to where they want to go quickly. So I would probably start with a blank canvas and say, okay, we're going to at least use a common kind of code.
Well, you stole what I was going to say, as they always say.
That's cool. Well, let me get to the next question. In hindsight, what's the one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you began your payroll career?
Well, it goes back to actually what I did say about keeping this open mindset and really thinking about and developing your skills. So at the start of my career, so I've had quite a varied career. At the start of the career, I perhaps didn't really see the opportunities that might be out there and how you can, once you start in a particular role, how you can actually change and move to complementary roles by using your skills in different ways and developing those skills and keeping things interesting by constantly evolving. And I would say perhaps, some of those earlier years, especially when I was in civil service, I didn't realise that quite so much. So I spent a little bit longer perhaps doing one role than I would have otherwise. So to others, I would say, constantly be looking for what is out there. How can you use your skills? How can you keep things interesting? If you're happy at work and interested in what you're doing, you add more value and you're normally better at your job as well. So that would be my piece of advice.
Fantastic. And last question to close the podcast. And you guys are both in a great position, I think, to answer this, because you're seeing it from a bird's eye view for many clients. What's the most common reason for businesses failing when it comes to providing a robust payroll service?
Following what others have done or following industry standard rather than understanding what the rules and legislation actually say. So again, sorry to bring it back to national minimum wage again, but a lot of the issues that we come across and have to support clients with is because they've followed the industry standard, or that's what we did last year. And so I think that's the main takeaway point for me.
I don't know if we can get any better than coming full circle. Right, we started with national minimum wage and holiday pay. We've got right back there to finish the podcast. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you both on the podcast. I'd like to thank you, Helen Kaye and Chris Robson, for joining me today. Of course, if you would like to find out more about the Deloitte consultancy practice, or if you'd like to contact either Chris or Helen directly, then I will put their LinkedIn profiles and the website URLs for Deloitte in the episode notes, so you can have a direct, just go to the episode notes and click on their names directly to connect. Is there any other links or any other information you'd like to share with the listeners now that they can go that might be useful for information? So I think there may be a website that's being developed on the pay governance piece.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is in development and should be ready very shortly. So what we'll do is we'll make sure that through our own LinkedIn pages and various, if they do want to click on, or if anybody wants to email us, then we can give a direct click through then to that link as soon as it's available.
Excellent, fantastic. And if it is out before this episode goes live, I'll make sure that's also in the episode notes. So take a quick look there first. and hopefully you can access that directly. Fantastic. That leads me just to finish. So, of course, if you are a payroll leader listening to this podcast and you have a payroll-related vacancy that you need support with, then I am also a payroll specialist recruiter, not just podcast host, and I would love to hear from you. You can contact me directly at nick@jgarecruitment.com or give me a call at 01727 800 377. But otherwise, I'd just like to say a huge thank you, Helen, a huge thank you, Chris, for joining me today.
Thank you.
And I'll speak to you all again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Payroll Podcast with Nick Day of JGA Recruitment. If you need help with a current payroll vacancy, then please get in touch with Nick and his team. All contact details can be found in the episode notes. In the meantime, to make sure you never miss a future episode, please subscribe to the show through any of your favourite podcast channels. Till next time.